not is an open question, I guess.
Yeah.
So clearly, at some level, having human DNA, right, having a human genome is required to make a human brain capable of human consciousness. So in a trivial sense, that's really, I guess, the basic relationship between those things. But more interestingly, I suppose what people want to know is a couple of things. One is, do differences in our DNA contribute to differences, maybe not in consciousness per se, but in our psychology and in our behavior? And to me, that trivially has to be yes. The answer to that has to be yes. And the reason is simply that if our nature, broadly speaking, is somehow encoded in our genome, in the same way that tigers have tiger nature and ants have ant nature because they have tiger DNA and ant DNA and so on, then it must be the case that there will also be some variation in our individual natures due to genetic variation. And that's just because genetic variation just happens. It just builds up over time. When DNA is copied, it's not copied perfectly every time. So some variation enters the population. And if that variation is tolerated by natural selection, that is, if it doesn't kill you or really reduce your number of offspring, then it just accumulates in the population, and it contributes to differences in our facial features and how tall we are, and the color of our skin and our eyes, and all sorts of traits like that we naturally expect to vary between people, and we don't just expect it, we observe that.
Yep.
And the same is true with the way our brain is put together. There's a basic sort of canonical human genome with a recipe for a canonical human brain, but none of us has that human genome or that brain. We all have our own individual version of it. And of course that, fits with all of the, well, first of all, it fits just with general experience. We know that people have, I think, innate natures that are different from each other. They have, personalities, they have intellectual capacities, they have behavioral tendencies that are pretty characteristic of them, even from an early age.
Yeah.
And we also know from, the whole field of behavioral genetics that we can see and even estimate sort of mathematically the contribution that genetic differences make to differences across the population in traits that, even if we just get a kind of an arbitrary measure like IQ, for example, it's an arbitrary number that is put on a trait that is just a response on a series of tests and so on, right? So, it's not a biological truth, but it's a proxy for something.
Yes.
For some suite of capacities that differ between people. And we can see that genetics makes a big difference to that and to personality traits and so on. So, so broadly speaking, there's differences between people in their genetics that contribute to differences in the way that their brains are wired, that in turn manifest as differences in their sort of innate psychological predispositions and capacities. So, on the first level, in terms of the relationship to human cognition, broadly speaking, and consciousness, you need a human genome to make a human brain, and different genomes will make slightly different brains, right? And in fact, even the same genome will make slightly different brains, because the genome doesn't encode a very specific outcome. It encodes really kind of a recipe or a program, a series of developmental steps that are going to happen, but not with infinite precision, because there isn't enough information in the genome to encode all of that. It just encodes biochemical rules and processes that play out so that the brain self-assembles, and the whole embryo obviously self-assembles and organizes. And that adds variation as well. So even between clones in animals, or monozygotic twins, identical twins in humans, we see variation in the way the brain gets put together, and variation in psychology as well. So that's even before any sort of experience happens.
Exactly.
It sets a kind of a baseline for differences that we have between us. Now, I don't want to be overly deterministic about that, because those differences contribute to the way our behavior emerges over our lifetime. They don't just dictate our behavior on a moment-to-moment basis. So that's the first sort of answer, I guess, in terms of that relationship between genetics and the manifestation of our psychology. And then the other one, which is where I'm sort of working on these days, is the question about agency that you referred to, and you can take what I just said and say, well, look, if I have these innate predispositions because my brain is wired a certain way, then how free really am I? Am I really in charge? Am I making decisions, or am I actually really constrained by the way my brain is at the moment? And that's true whether it's due to genetics or developmental variation, or even the accumulation of our experiences. You'd have the same question in an instant. Right now, when I'm making a decision, how much of that is open to me, and how much of it is constrained by the way I'm already put together?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find interesting too is, before at least I had conceptualized the idea of the human genome as being something that was contained with a massive amount of what they would refer to as junk DNA, DNA that didn't necessarily code for much or wasn't active. It wasn't an active participant in the generation of our phenotypical expression. And so I was always kind of wondering how we had 90% junk DNA. And now it seems to me there's a little bit more of a dynamic model of genetics, to where this expression of genes is ultimately influenced by our agency, almost, so to speak. Our environment, our nurture does
Yeah.
have an impact upon the activation and expression of certain genes that are within this human genome template. And that's an interesting facet. The epigenetic component of it really kind of permits that randomness to exist, to where certain genes activate on certain conditions, and ultimately over time you can see neurogenesis kind of occurring too, where neuron action potentials are begetting furthermore neurons and strengthening those connective regions of the brain. So whenever you think of the dynamic emerging model of genetics and how we can turn off and turn on certain genes, that influence their kind of, what do you see, how do you see that in relation to like a physicalist viewpoint? It kind of seems to me that it starts to dismantle physicalism a little bit, because we see rewiring of the brain in such a way that we can initiate the same kind of emotional states through different pathways, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on a load of really interesting questions there, and I think that sort of plasticity undermines maybe determinism more than physicalism, in the sense that it's all still physical mechanisms that are being carried out, but it represents a more interactive view of the relationship between the organism and its environment, and rather than either the organism just being on a fixed trajectory that's completely determined by its genome, or the organism being completely driven by what's happening in the environment. There's a middle ground there where the organism is interacting with its environment, that's shaping the environment, and in turn it's feeding back onto the organism, and the organism is adapting itself to what's happening in the environment. And that's a very sort of central part of biology, but it's an evolved trait, in the sense that some organisms are more plastic and adaptable and flexible than others, right? Some have a very fixed kind of a lifestyle and ecology, and others have a very flexible lifestyle and ecology. And I think we probably have the most flexible lifestyle, given that our cognitive abilities grant us a huge amount of both behavioral flexibility and control over our own environment. So, but even the simplest organisms, even bacteria, are constantly adapting to their environments, and one of the ways that they do that is they turn genes on or they turn genes off, right? So each gene is just basically a recipe for a protein, and at any given moment, a bacterium, depending on what environment it's in, may need more of proteins A, B, and C, or more proteins D, E, and F, right?
Yeah.
So many years ago, when the first sort of understanding of how genes are expressed was coming out, it was studies in bacteria where, in response to certain sugars, for example, they could turn on some enzymes that are needed to digest those sugars. But because bacteria have to be so streamlined metabolically, when those sugars are not around, they don't turn on those proteins, right? Because it's wasteful. So the people who were studying that, guys named Jacob and Monod, were very clear that it had very strong implications for development, even in multicellular organisms, and for adaptability on an organismal scale for larger organisms as well. Because if you think about that, that bacterium, it has one genome, but it can switch between different states. It's like a tractor states in a dynamical system, right? You can have one state here, one state over there. You can switch between them, and there's many, many states that you can go between depending on what the environment is. And in development of a multicellular organism, the exact same thing happens. It's just that the environment that each cell is in is a part of the embryo, right? So if you're in this part of the embryo, you're going to turn on the genes to make the nervous system. And if you're in that part of the embryo, you're going to turn on the genes to make gut, and so on. So again, all of the gene expression is very dynamic. And that's just a normal sort of process of genetic regulation. So, but within the nervous system, of course, we get a whole other level of flexibility and plasticity. And of course, in the nervous system, you've got dynamic neural activity, but you've also got highly dynamic neural structure. So the connections between neurons are, first of all, being regulated at a biochemical level, just like bacteria turning on some proteins and turning others off. That's happening in your neurons extremely rapidly all the time. Yeah. And then you've also got anatomical plasticity, which takes longer, but also lasts longer, and creates new connections, strengthens connections or weakens connections, prunes them away, in a way that's very similar, not coincidentally, to how artificial neural networks are set up. That's how deep learning works, for example, and strengthens some connections and weakens others. And in that way, it embodies memories about things. It embodies knowledge about the world. It embodies statistical regularities and expectations and predictions and so on. So we're doing that all the time. And our brains are obviously highly plastic, but to an extent that's not, it's not like they're constantly roiling. I mean, there's some point at which your brain is, the major sort of circuits are set, right? Yeah. And then at the microstructural level, in some areas of the brain, it's really, really plastic. But the organism has to have a balance between being completely plastic, in which case it never remembers anything for any length of time.
Yeah.
Versus, being able to maintain what it has while still allowing some flexibility going forward.
Yep. And that makes sense too. Yeah. So you have to have that dynamic relational response between context and what is existent within the context as a system as a whole, operating kind of conjointly together. And what you mentioned too about the levels of agency that we have, it seems to me kind of like when you look at the relationship between humans and plants, of course, we share DNA. We share that basic machine code that ultimately assembles together this organizational structure, and plants having agency to a certain extent, but it appears only to an extent by which it can attend to its homeostatic desires, reaching out and having these mutualistic connections with fungi and things of that nature to and further its offspring and then also survive. It has no option by which to relocate itself to another environment. And when you think of a plant like that, using the same type of code, basic code to generate a plant, and then you think about the human being and the nervous system, you see this very odd change in evolution where it happened to be now we can mitigate between lower level homeostatic drives and what we desire to be meaningful and try to find a counterbalance between those two. And so to me, it's very interesting to understand the nervous system's evolution as a whole. It's almost like with its arrival on the scene in evolution, it began to promote different actualization means. Basically, we would go towards food and reproduction, but we would do so with more of a mechanism behind it that's driven towards meaning. So we would proceed with monogamy and have families and have these values. And those are all products of the nervous system applying meaning to its context. And I just kind of wanted to ask you about, the nervous system coming onto the scene in evolution. What do you think when you think of that as its purpose? What would have evolution and natural selection would have selected for this re-representation of our environment so that we can then, advance to the point where meaning becomes our ultimate driving force.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a super interesting question. And really, when you're drawing that sort of comparison between plants and us, you can draw a more basic one between plants and animals, of things that move and things that don't.
Yeah.
And, plants like bacteria will regulate their gene expression, they'll regulate their sort of whole plant physiology and so on, in response to different conditions in the environment. And so they have, in a sense, a kind of an agency there. It's just not an agency where they act on the world, right? They act on themselves, but they don't act on the world, and they don't move in the world. And of course, one of the advantages of movement and behavior, really as a form of homeostasis, is if you're in a certain area and you use up all the resources there and there's no food around, you can change your metabolism all you like. You're still going to starve to death, probably.
Yeah.
But if you can move to another place, then the same homeostatic drive is now executed as a behavior to try and put you back in the positive homeostatic state, right? The signal that says, yes, I'm doing good, I have good nutrients, and I can even reproduce if I want to, and so on, right? So, very simple organisms, earliest animals, had those kinds of capabilities. Even bacteria and so many protists can move around and do. And then you have a question, okay, well, which way should I move?
Yeah.
And that starts to be really interesting, because then it's worthwhile for the organism to try and get some information about what's out in the world, to instruct it or inform it as to which way it should move. And then you start to get coupling of sensors for things like food sources or threats out in the environment. And they get coupled somehow to motors like a flagellum or cilia, or things that move single-celled organisms around. And there I think you have the birth of meaning, really, because when, say, a bacterium senses a chemical, that is coupled to a transition to move more in one direction versus another. And natural selection gives a verdict on that being a good thing to do or not. And so really there's a value there because the organism has a goal. The goal is to persist. And natural selection rewards the things that persist better. And that inevitably gives you this sort of normativity within the system, which is an anchor for the meaning. Right? So it's not just information when the receptor gives a little wiggle inside the cell when it detects something outside the cell. It's not a physical energy force. It really is just a conformational change. It's just information. And the response of the cell to that is to move. Now, that's a pretty basic kind of response. And you could make a robot that could do that. And people have made robots that move towards the light or whatever,
Yeah.
And you can get some pretty interesting behavior out of just almost sort of low level, pretty direct couplings like that.
Yes.
And even within that kind of a system, you can integrate a few different signals at once. And bacteria do that as well. They integrate, multiple chemical signals. They change how they're moving depending on their metabolic state and the temperature and the osmolarity and all kinds of things. So they're really behaving as a whole agent, as an organism, not as a machine. You can get an overly mechanistic kind of view of it, but it's still a kind of a simple enough mechanism within it that the agent uses to tell it where to go. But when organisms got bigger, when multicellular organisms came on the scene, they needed some way to coordinate their various bits. So even things like sponges, I mean, the simplest organisms, or things like hydra or jellyfish and so on, they have to be able to coordinate the movement of various bits. And so somewhere sort of between the evolution of sponges and early jellyfish type things, neurons emerged, probably first as a system that was just kind of a parallel net between muscles. So muscles and neurons emerged or evolved around the same time, probably in conjunction with each other. They both use electrical signals. In muscles, they're used to contract physically the thing. In neurons, of course, they just sort of process and integrate electrical information and convey it. But the first nervous systems probably were just used for muscular coordination. So to set a repertoire of actions that a multicellular organism could do.
Yep.
But having done that, of course, they still also want to know, well, what action should I do?
Yeah.
And that depends on coupling. Again, you want to get sensory information and bring that in. And you can do that like in a simple organism. You can have a kind of a direct coupling between a sensory neuron and a muscle and just, fire it like that. But if you add an intervening layer, then you can start to do some interesting things. Then you can couple multiple signals. You can have a layer here that will fire the muscle if it gets this signal and this signal at the same time. Or if it gets this signal and not that signal at the same time. So you can start to do some kind of internal information processing and computation, basically, on that signal. And once you get those sorts of intervening layers between some sort of sensory information and the ongoing behavioral repertoire that the organism's engaged in, then you can inform that action, but you can also have these internal representations that I think start to be the basis of what we would recognize as cognition. They can be operated on within that kind of a shared space, and you can integrate. Once you have multiple levels and so on, you can extract all kinds of more interesting information. You can integrate lots of signals at the same time without having to necessarily execute an action. So you can decouple them from the action and only do the action after you integrate all those signals if you want to. So I think that's for me the origins of the nervous system are, first of all, as a control system, just really an elaboration of the control systems that we see in simpler organisms. But once that's in place, it becomes incredibly flexible and scalable. And that's really, I think, the magic of neurons, is that you can just add more and more of them, right? Like you can add more, transistors on a chip, and you get more interesting, deeper kind of behavior potentially out of that. Again, all in the service of control, though, controlling what the organism, or allowing the organism to control what it does to manage its goals, to adjudicate between different kinds of stimuli in the world, different options that it has, and eventually to execute one of a number of actions that it can only do one at a time. So you need some control system in a cybernetic sense to manage all of that.
That's an apt description of kind of how it seems to pervade kind of the co-evolution of nervous system and muscularity. Because with a muscle, you have the sodium-potassium pump kind of constantly exchanging these ions, but without the nervous system to signal that exchange of ions at the contraction of the muscle, you don't really have either. So they're kind of interdependent upon each other. And that's an co-evolution of those two things is interesting. But additional to that, kind of going back to what you said about movement, something I find interesting when it comes to defining consciousness, as it relates to agency, especially, is having to get back to the crux of what movement really is. And doing so, I was looking into studies on anesthesiology and basically anesthetizing all single cellular bacterium. They can anesthetize bacterium at the single cellular prokaryotic level and anesthetize a human being at a multicellular eukaryotic, multi-organ system organism. And both of those, there's a commonality, it seems, with anesthetization between all living organisms. That is the interruption of the mitochondria to produce energy, and also the action of the microtubule or the cytoskeleton to initiate its movement. So it seems to me like we generally associate the administration of anesthesia with the removal of consciousness for a certain period of time, and that eliminates completely the ability to operate as an agent. And so if we can actually anesthetize a single cell bacterium and prevent it from moving, at that point, we're implying that, okay, consciousness exists within that bacteria, and that the commonality of anesthetization between unicellular prokaryotes to multicellular eukaryotes, there's a commonality that, okay, consciousness is extracted and movement is ultimately dependent upon this consciousness as what drives it to move in the first place, like basically the mover of all movements, so to speak.
So I guess I'd query that interpretation maybe. First of all, I think most anesthetics are paralytics as much as they have multiple actions, and just paralyzing you is one of the actions. And in fact, some people under general anesthesia don't lose consciousness, but they're paralyzed, and they don't feel pain, but they're aware of what's happening during an operation and so on. So you can actually dissociate those two kinds of things. And I'm not aware of the studies you're talking about in bacteria, but it feels like it might be difficult to distinguish whether you made the bacterium unaware of its surroundings, if it could even be said to be aware, or you have just paralyzed it in some way by disrupting the microtubules, for example, or something else required for movement. But I guess the other thing would be whether, when you say consciousness, what you mean by that.
Yeah.
If you mean sentience, then I think I'd be happy to agree that there's a continuum from the earliest bacteria which respond adaptively to their environment. So I think that's a reasonable definition or understanding of what sentience should be.
Yep.
Up to what we have, which is sapience, I think, where we're not just able to think about things in the world. We're not just able to think about objects and percepts. So we're able to think about our own thoughts.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of a higher order level of cognition, which I think is associated with what we view as human consciousness. And but yeah, again, it comes to a really interesting question about what does consciousness get you? If you're following this idea, this evolutionary idea that nervous systems are part of the control system,
yes,
right? That's their function.
Yeah,
their function is to control behavior in order for the organism to maintain itself. Then there's a kind of a question, well, what does consciousness get you, as opposed to just a more sophisticated control system? Why does this sort of subjective experience of it exist? And it's a really tricky question, because I think you can make a kind of an argument about a central arena of where you have some metacognition, where you have some working memory that's focused on a few particular things at a time. You've got this sort of common arena where thoughts and ideas can be operated on without any sort of obligate expression in behavior. All of that, I think you can talk about without it necessarily requiring or involving any kind of subjective experience.
Correct. Yeah, I agree with you there.
Yeah.
And I get, sorry about that. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say, so the question of what the subjective experience part of it gets you, I think becomes a really interesting one. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right. And I think that's why maybe it's dubbed the hard problem so infamously, at least in the West. I know that there's this duality between the East and West as far as if that even is a problem to begin with. We've kind of, in my opinion, seems created a problem out of subjective experience more so than accepted it as a byproduct of context-dependent interaction. And in your report or your paper that you had written at the 8 points kind of arguing for agent causality, which is extremely detailed and one of the most comprehensive papers I've ever read that really does encapsulate how we can naturalistically explain this phenomena. However, what I did want to kind of clarify, if you can entertain a little bit of this panpsychic type philosophy for a second, is consciousness as a definition to me has become the arena, like you had said. It's ultimately something. It's like if you had a large circle and then concentric circles within inside of that everything within that circle of consciousness has to have agency by result of being within that context, essentially. So if, I guess, an analogy to compare it to would be if you have a bunch of transistors on a motherboard and a processor and things of that nature, they exist on that motherboard, and by nature of that, they have a state of 1 or a state of 0, and they have to be in one or the other by the nature of simply being a transistor. And so the human mind, to me, and agency seem to be an inevitable process that would occur if you exist within this field of consciousness. If consciousness is seen as an arena, you exist within it. And I kind of view consciousness as information at its core. It's this information field. And when you exist within it, you have to embody its parameters and its constraints that exist within that realm. And so by existing within that informational field, you then are granted agency, because you have to then, if you have neurons in your brain that are either firing or not firing, at that point there's an agency that exists there, whether it's a little bit automatic or not. You have to choose one or the other. And it almost comes as a byproduct or an inevitability of consciousness.
I get the idea. I'm not super sympathetic to the broad sort of consciousness pervading everything idea, I have to say, because I find it doesn't do much explanatory work for me. It doesn't get me any further, to be honest. And so I tend more towards a gradualistic evolutionary approach, where I'm happy to have some agency in really simple organisms, like bacteria, even I would call agents. And some people look at them as really linear stimulus response machines, and that's a complete reduction in my view, and absolutely wrong. Yeah. They're endogenously active organisms that use information from the outside world to inform which way they should go, but they're not just being pushed around by things in the environment. And as you get more and more sophisticated, as you get nervous systems, as you add internal layers, then first of all, you're increasing cognitive depth. So for example, when organisms moved onto land, then they could see a lot further than they could in the water, right? So long distance vision became really valuable. And then long distance cognition becomes really valuable, because you can literally see things coming from a mile away. And temporally speaking, you're now having to think about, 5 minutes from now, what's that thing going to do to me? So you get this sort of scaling up of cognitive depth, and the animals, as they got more sophisticated along some arms of the evolutionary tree, had more things to think about. And it became valuable to extract information about what was out in the world, what are the objects out there, and relate that to what the organism could do with them, or what they could do to the organism. So really value-oriented, meaning-oriented kind of perception, where you're talking about affordances with the world. I can eat that. It can eat me. I should run away from that. I should go towards this thing. I mate with that, or whatever, or I can use this as a tool. So all of those things, you get this sort of gradual increase in cognitive depth and sophistication of what it is that organisms are capable of thinking about, and along with the ecological evolution into niches where it's valuable to think about those things. And every time organisms increased a little bit in cognitive sophistication, they opened up new environmental niches, new pressures, including in some cases the pressure to again increase cognitive depth and so on. So if you keep doing that, now this gets a bit hand wavy, right? But at least there's a plausible scenario in which you ultimately get to the point where you have levels of the nervous system, each of which is getting information from below, that are so abstract that they're really just thinking about your thoughts. They're really just the objects of cognition up here at this highest level are really the thoughts and ideas from down below. They're not about an object in the world. They're about types of objects. They're not about a particular person. They're about, and their relation to you, they're about types of relations, causal relations between things. So much more abstract ideas, and that gets you two things. First of all, it gives you much more cognitive, rational control over your goals, much longer term planning, and more powerful executive function and so on over much longer time horizons. But secondly, it may feel like something. It may just inevitably feel like something to be thinking about your thoughts. And that, again, it's not a very satisfying explanation to say that. No. But it feels a bit more naturalistic, I guess, than to sort of invoke the idea of a universal field of consciousness that we're all embedded in, because I don't see the evidence for that, and I don't see what that gets you, in terms of thinking further on.
No, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, and it does come off pseudoscientific, of course, especially when you're talking philosophy of mind. It generally kind of trends in that direction. But like you had said, these higher levels of cognition that we have as humans, it's interesting to see like the pyramidal neurons. Whenever you reach that level of activation, you have that higher level of cognition that occurs through the cortex. And so as the cortex, got thicker and there's more brain matter, we had those higher levels of computation, which ultimately seem to have led to the meta concept, which references self to other. And that in itself, to me, is such an enigma to explain within natural selection, because what has that done for the furthering of our species except destructive nature of it, really?
Yeah. Well, so there's a really interesting idea, which is to recognize that the purpose of consciousness may not stop with individuals, and in fact may not be even strongly just within individuals at all. It may be a social thing, right? So you and I can have this conversation because we're both able to express our ideas, right? We have access to the ideas that we're having in our brains, and we can tell each other about them. And on a much simpler level, if I wanted something, I could tell you that I want it, right? And so in terms of social interactions and social communication, consciousness, as in terms of a window onto our own minds that allows us, with obviously the development of language, to express that to other people, could have been, probably was, a massive boost to our own evolution and our own evolutionary success in the world. And so there's certainly a reasonable model or hypothesis that consciousness actually, at its core, what it gives us is very much a socially mediated benefit, not so much an individually mediated one.
I see. And that makes sense that language would be correlated to that, because once language evolved and we're able to apply those heuristics of communication between ourselves and another, it promotes our success as a society and as a collective group. However, just on that topic, I noticed kind of one of the arguments presented in your paper was kind of it's too arbitrary to reduce this down to just mechanistic computation, because it's so contextually dependent that it inevitably would have to have more than just a mechanical mechanism. Well, my question that comes about when I think about, well, if meaning comes about by basically, if causal activity, I believe, like you had said, maybe in one of your videos I had watched, by virtue of meaning, and meaning is a direct result of embodiment of context, then we have to kind of extrapolate that. What is that context? And so to me, I started to formulate, not that consciousness pervades everything, so to speak, like a rock is having an experience, but more so that the context by which things exist within is consciousness, if you equate consciousness to information in a certain.
Yeah. So I think we can just say information. We want to have integrated information and context. I don't see that calling that consciousness is appropriate, actually, given the sort of normal understanding of the word consciousness. So but I think you're absolutely along the right lines generally, apart from the use of the word there that I just wouldn't use myself. But with the idea that each of us is embedded in an informational context, and everything about our interactions with the environment is relational, and basically, again, as a control system, the best control systems predict things about their environment. They embody things about the world, and that's what our nervous systems do. They embody knowledge about the world and statistical regularities and contingencies and dependence relations between things that we can use to better further our own persistence over much longer time horizons, and juggling many, many more factors at once, because we have a more sophisticated toolbox to manipulate all of those different factors. So I mean, I like very much the idea of that sort of informational the idea that context really is everything, and that organisms are embodying the context that they're in adaptive ways. And in fact, there's really good mathematical and physical formalisms of that, as I'm sure you're aware. That there's one by Suzanne Still, a physicist, about thermodynamic systems. Basically, any open thermodynamic system will have to embody its environment and make predictions about it in order to persist. And it goes back to Ross Ashby's good regulator theorem in cybernetics. And of course, there's a lot of interest these days in the free energy principle as a formulation of that kind of idea as well.
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't actually looked into or haven't really heard much about the mathematics behind understanding of the open thermodynamic system, but it does seem to make intuitive sense that it's hard to differentiate closed and open systems when you're talking about any kind of matter, because ultimately it's interacting with its environment over time in either a manner of degradation or a manner of increased complexity. And what is that? What's mediating that process? So thermodynamics ultimately is an interesting phenomena that we fight against entropy to slowly build complexity over time. And the mathematics that I'm not too familiar with, but that I utilized kind of to come up with this information idea was the concept of black holes, essentially, in physics. And that when things fall into black holes, it was perceived prior that this information was destroyed and disappeared. And then, of course, this was reconfigured within physics to be understood as actually it was reproduced in a 2D informational fashion proportional to the surface area of the black hole. And that was then formulated in 2D information. So this information that was contained within an object falling into a black hole would then be reconfigured as information on its surface. And that, to me, kind of reduces down any matter to information. And so that kind of extrapolated from that to, okay, well, if that's the potential, and we're looking at DNA kind of as, if we have A, T, C, and G as our basis building blocks of DNA, and that's the machine code that's coding for our phenotypical expression, what's the operating system that is then employed to take the sensory data by the nervous system and convert that into self, environment, and how we operate within it. Yeah. And so the machine code of DNA to produce the organism makes sense hardware-wise. And then it almost seems to me almost like a software type of conversion that must be occurring whenever we look at perception visually. We see like the Fermion transformation, where you're looking at light and it's basically being configured into 3D reality.
And so you get into really, really interesting stuff there. And of course, information, any information is basically a physical arrangement of matter. So there's no sort of disembodied, magical information just floating around, right? So it's interesting because once you start thinking about that kind of stuff, then you can end up in two different ways. One is that you would just say, okay, well, you say information, it's just matter. At the end of the day, it's just still matter and energy, and it all reduces to material and efficient causes, to use Aristotle's terms. And it's all just mechanism. And in fact, I think that's the mistake, because you can see in the nervous system, even as I said, in a simple bacterium, it's not a transfer of energy or matter that is important. It's a transfer of information. It's a change in the conformation of some protein or the activity level of some cell, or I should say the pattern of activity of a cell, not the level even, that the system is configured to respond to that in a certain way, or to interpret it in a certain way. And that's where actually I think a tricky thing these days is to go from information theory, which is very sort of mathematically grounded and quantitative and so on, to a theory of meaning, which is far more nebulous. And it feels kind of, I think some people are sort of suspicious of the term. It doesn't feel very scientific. It sounds kind of mystical. It's hard to quantify. It's hard to localize. You can't say even where the meaning is or how much meaning there is in the words that I'm telling you right now.
Exactly.
Whereas you could say exactly how much information there is, how many bits of information it takes to transmit them, and so on. So for me, the key there is to understand that the causation the things that have causal power in a biological system are historical. It's not just an instantaneous physical system. The history of the system imbues it with causal power.
I see. Yeah.
And it configures it in a certain way such that the system will interpret certain patterns of, say, neural activity as meaning A or B or C. And depending on what that meaning is, something else will happen. Some other set of neurons will interpret it, and it'll feed into the big cognitive processes that are ongoing. And so one of the interesting sort of aspects there, if that's going to be true, you actually need to have some indeterminacy in the world.
Correct.
If everything is completely deterministic at the lowest level, if all the causal power is reducible to just, you know, the atoms bouncing off each other and the strong and weak nuclear force and gravity and electromagnetism and so on, then and everything is determined by that, then there's no room for any sort of higher order structure with meaning in it to evolve. It just won't. And whereas if there's a little bit of slack in the system in terms of what's causing what, then you can have the organization of the system doing some causal work. And in our brains, the causal work that it's doing is mediated by the meaning of the patterns for the organism. That still have to be grounded, right? I mean, that's where things get a little complicated. Yeah. Talk about representation, some pattern of activity is some part of my brain, and it means something to me. Well, where does that meaning come from? And I think an interesting way to tackle that problem is to reverse it. And, you know, various people have made these arguments, people like Giovanni Pezzulo, for example, about it, rather than it being a symbol grounding problem, where the meaning of the pattern has to be grounded somehow, you actually have a symbol detachment problem, where initially in evolution, the meaning, say, of a signal in a receptor being activated in a bacterium, the meaning of that is move away. Right? It's not you have detected X, and then the bacterium says, oh, I've detected X. I wonder what I should do next. It's just the meaning is move away, and that's a good meaning if it's a threatening stimulus, right? So they're immediately coupled like that. But as I was talking about earlier, if you put some neurons in there, and you have some intervening layers, then you've detached the symbols from obligate action, but they're still grounded at either end, right? They still refer to something by virtue of the inputs from the sensory side, no matter how many levels away they are. And they still have some consequence or potential applicability for the action of the organism in doing something. So in that way, I think you can get around the grounding problem by taking the evolutionary approach, or indeed an ontogenetic approach in individuals, like babies learning about what's in the world. They're sort of calibrating the meaning of different patterns of things in their brain as they interact with the world. So yeah, I think you can get to a position where the nervous system is really running on meaning. That's what drives the mechanism, and it moves you away from a reductive kind of mechanistic view and towards a more holistic, without being woo mystical kind of holistic, just a scientifically holistic view, both of the organism as a whole in interaction with its environment, but extended over time, right? Over the lifetime of the individual, the causation is extended, and over the evolutionary time as well, in terms of what information there is in the genome that makes an organism that's pre-specified and ready to interact with an environment that it expects to be there.
Wow, yeah, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of deep meaning. And I guess one of the things that strikes me too, the grounding problem, of course, does exist there, and it's an interesting within visual perception as well, is when we distinguish a background from when we look at a white wall and we see a white object on it. When they take robots, it's almost impossible to get a robot to be able to distinguish the white painting on a white wall, but we're able to distinguish the ground from the foreground in a similar manner. It's not necessarily comparative directly. However, it is an interesting idea to where we're able to visual perception has been something that's completely complex to me to figure out really what that is. But the grounding issue, it seems to be in visual perception, is we're able to very intricately distinguish the background from the object, and robots seemingly cannot do that with very much ease, and we do it with relative ease. And grounding grounding all of these grounding meaning within consciousness, of course, is, from the evolutionary perspective, probably the most naturalistic scientific route to proceed with, at least to stay within logic. But for a second to kind of deviate from that, I wanted to ask you, basically, when we're talking about the brain and we're talking about how it influences our behaviors, I notice sometimes your comparisons to circuitry, to basically electrical circuits, which makes sense because our electrical impulses are firing in neurons. They have a resting, they have a resting potential there. So it has a voltage essentially by existing. And when I was kind of thinking about it, parallel electrical circuits are interesting because you have multiple routes by which the current can flow through. And so if one branch of that circuit is severed, you still have circuits in other areas that are able to operate because it didn't sever that series circuit, like a string of lights, and you cut one. But if you have it in parallel, you can still produce these processes, or you can still have some of the lights on in there with the severing of a different portion of that circuitry. And so I find it quite interesting when you look at the model of the brain with neurogenesis, when you see they've done mindfulness studies and things of that nature that have shown the actual increase in density of neural matter over time in certain areas. And it's almost like that circuit is in parallel, and it's reconfiguring ways to get that information to the certain parts of the brain. And so if somebody has experienced trauma of some type and that has affected their cognition because of the wiring that's in their physical matter, it can then be repaired through certain types of practices, and that ultimately is observable in the third person standpoint by neurogenerative increases. And so it's like our brain is self-organizing itself to accommodate even a destruction of what it was originally set to be. So if we had this circuitry, well, I guess it's kind of hard to use a blueprint as like an architectural blueprint as a model, because that's a static blueprint. But what I find interesting with that is when an architect produces a blueprint for a building, and then a contractor goes and proceeds to build that building, at the end, there's a set of drawings that are produced that are records of all the changes made to that building over time. And so inevitably, the ultimate blueprint for that building is not going to be close. It's going to be very different from what the architect intended it to be at the beginning. And to me, that kind of at least allows, like, okay, maybe the grounding is the blueprint, and the as-built record drawing of what we ultimately produce creates that.
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, I think that you've hit upon an interesting sort of distinction between the architect and the contractor. And the blueprint idea or that metaphor is one that I argue against when it comes to the genome, because the parts of the, for a blueprint, a part of the blueprint corresponds to a part of the outcome, the product, right? And that's not the relationship with the genome at all. And what's interesting, though, in a blueprint is you've got the final product, but the architect rarely has instructions on how to build it. Right? It just says, this is what I want built, and then the builder has to figure out how to build it. Well, so the instructions for how to build it, that's more like what's in the genome, actually. It's more like what the contractor has than what the architect has. And in fact, it's almost like the genome has instructions to build it, but it has no idea what the final outcome is. And it doesn't need to know, right? Nobody in the genome needs to know what it's building. It just sort of happens, right? But that's where the instructions are to build an organism, I think. As far as like repair goes and neurogenesis and so on, first of all, I guess I would sound a cautious note in interpreting studies like ones you mentioned about things like mindfulness and neurogenesis and so on. There, in my experience, a lot of that literature is not so rigorous, and so I'm kind of skeptical of it, frankly. Now, having said that, the brain does show remarkable capabilities for repair and regrowth under some circumstances, while in other cases it just doesn't repair itself at all, right? And so you can see, some stroke patients will recover really well, others will never recover. And so there are, there are really strong limits to how much the brain can repair itself. And there are even a lot of arguments and controversy about whether there's any adult neurogenesis going on in humans at all, as there seems to be in rodents, for example. So there's a lot of controversy just about some of those issues. Having said that, there is a lot of remodeling that can happen where if one circuit is damaged, then you can get some sort of parallel circuits that form eventually that allow the same sort of functions to be carried out, as you were saying, but through a different route. And that can come about not so much by addition of new neurons as the growth of connections from neurons that were there, and they grow into an area. So say when an area loses its connections, its inputs, then inputs from over here sometimes grow into it. So there's a lot of plastic kind of processes that happen like that. And I guess actually just to get back to where we started thinking about agency in and the influence of agency over our own development, I think you get into some really interesting territory there, because we are, we're born at a certain stage, right? But our brain doesn't stop developing; it's still growing and so on. And we have this very, very long period where before we reach, sexual maturity, where our brains are incredibly plastic, and we're experiencing all these things and we're remodeling, and that long period is one of the benefits of our human development, in that we get a really, really long time to learn about things. The downside is, of course, that human children are helpless for a long period of time. Right? So there's a payoff there. But during that process, we're not just passive, we're very much active agents in shaping the experiences that we have and the environments that we're in. We select environments, and in a way that then feeds back onto the development of our own brains, the development of our habits, the emergence of our character through time. And so, to come back to where we started with, thinking about, our psychological predispositions and saying, well, I'm just wired a certain way and I didn't choose that. So am I really in control? Well, actually, a lot of it you did choose, all through your life. Right now, the way you are right now, you were very much an active agent in shaping, your character as you've gone through life. So it's not true to say that all these prior causes had nothing to do with you. You were very much involved in shaping the person that you are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and of course that's an important precept to have, because if one were to devolve the idea of free will and conscious will and make those two ideas synonymous and then state that they were illusory, you essentially induce nihilism, which is damaging to, at least personally to me. Whenever I had a nihilistic framing of the world, I noticed that fed into my feedback loops of how I acted, because I didn't have that actualized meaning pursuit. And so when I look at the pursuit of meaning and things of that nature, it's ultimately dependent upon the acknowledgement of agency. And if you don't give that agency some acknowledgement, then you dispense with the notion of illusory free will, which takes away your idea of virtue and acting virtuously in the world. And to circle back quickly to your point on indeterminacy, and I agree with you 100% that it's not even metaphysical or pseudoscientific to say that indeterminacy is embedded into the quantum field theory, and the mathematics that have come out in quantum field theory have ultimately begat provable, observable inventions. And so we know that at least the mathematics are solid, and we know that within that mathematics there is uncertainty, and we know that there's particle and wave duality, and we know that something about that collapses. And so to me, it's very important, like you said, to acknowledge that a little bit of that indeterminacy. And then scientifically, I've noticed that with the work of Dr. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, and the idea of the orth-OR consciousness, which is basically assuming that there is a quantum relationship between our brains and the microtubules in our brains and the microtubules in our bodies. The cytoskeletal elements of that are in a constant state of quantum superposition. They're both ones and zeros at the same time, and that the relationship between that and information essentially collapses that duality of superposition down into one option. So my kind of scientific, pseudoscientific conceptualization was, well, if we've observed in photosynthetic plants that with light, as far as the photon, when it's taken in through the leaf, it's in multiple places at once. So essentially, it can happen within a living organism without being at absolute zero temperatures, which is what normally people assume. And so being able to at least observe quantum activity such as superposition at non-absolute zero temperatures proves, okay, even in a moist environment like the brain, you could potentially induce quantum states based on that observation. Yeah. And maybe that collapse of that quantum state of being in two places at once to one place, or a wave to a particle, or however that wants to be conceptualized, could be the idea of will at that point, could be the whole perception of choice, potentially, being that microtubules have been shown, they're made up of tubulin fibers, and those are always in a quantum state, it seems. They're not determined. So I kind of see maybe will as being in there somewhere.
Yeah, I know Penrose's theories. I'm not a fan, I have to say, because I think it. First of all, I don't know why he fixates on microtubules in particular, as opposed to all the other proteins and molecules that are there in a cell. I don't see what would be special about microtubules. But secondly, I think it's looking for the link between quantum indeterminacy and high-level functions like cognitive rational control. He's looking for that link to be much more direct than I think it actually is. And so I have a different model on it, and it's very much still speculative.
Yeah.
But so the idea is that the indeterminacy at the quantum level just means that there's room for organizational power to have some causal control, right? So for a system to organize itself in such a way that the organization is doing some causal work. And I don't know why that seems to be difficult for some people to grasp when it's such a completely commonplace sort of notion, right? That organization of something does causal work over and above any kind of matter, energy, force, low-level physics, right? I mean, it's why we pay football managers so much money, because they organize the team to do something in a way that they wouldn't do if they weren't organized like that. So I think there's the indeterminacy for me creates some causal slack in the system. It allows feedback through selection to generate functional architectures and configurations of a system. But I mean, it's interesting to think about where that indeterminacy lies and what the relationship is between the quantum level and the classical level. Because a lot of people would say, well, that all that quantum stuff disappears when objects get big enough and there are enough elements in them that they're interacting in such a way that you get quantum decoherence, and then it just means that there's no indeterminacy left, and classical things are deterministic. And it's always seemed arbitrary to me at what level, what scale do you go when that quantum to classical transition happens? And there's never been any kind of principled explanation for that until, I think, actually one that I recently came across from Lee Smolin and Clelia Verde, which is, rather than saying it's a spatial thing, they say it's a temporal thing. But actually, the indeterminacy is in the future. In the future, things are indeterminate. They don't have definite positions. The numbers that describe them don't have infinitely precise parameters to them. But as they interact with each other, then they become fixed through that interaction in the period that we call the present, when events are happening, right? So events happening is what defines time passing. And then after the events have happened, all those things are fixed. That's now the past. And the future is still fuzzy and open. It means the future really is not determined. It's not that there are branching pathways. It's just that there's a sort of a general fuzziness. And it links to some work by Nicolas Gizan on the idea that real numbers, which are used to describe physical parameters, cannot possibly be given with infinite precision all at once, because then they would have every real number would have infinite information in it, which just isn't possible in a physically finite universe.
Yeah.
So, I think Cezanne's model and Smolin's model actually merge really nicely together, where they say it doesn't matter what the scale is. There's going to be some indeterminacy in the future. The further you go in the future, the less definite things are. As that approaches the present and things are interacting with each other, they're forcing them to become defined. They're forcing them to take on real values, and then they're fixed. But during that period of time, right, during that duration, which is not an instant, it's a duration, things can go one way or another, right? And the way that your nervous system is configured is part of the thing that causes things to go one way or another.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense. It's the idea that there's unpredictability from the present moving forward, and there's not a mathematical set of parameters that can be applied to say that right now I'm doing this, and in 10 minutes this will occur, because we have no idea what will occur in that 10 minutes.
And not only do we not know, it's not just unpredictability in an epistemological sense. It's indeterminacy in an ontological sense. And it actually comes down to even saying that, for some things, there's no truth value right now as to whether they are or are not bigger or smaller than 1 or 2 or 10 or whatever it is, right? It's not true that they either are or are not. It's just unknown. It's not false either, right? Exactly. So it actually, undercuts this fundamental premise in logic called the law of the excluded middle, which says it must be either true or false. And maybe we just don't know. But this different way of seeing the mathematics says, no, actually, it's neither true nor false yet. It will be true or false at some time, but it has to get to the present.
I see, and that's still that's kind of in line too with quantum theory, because it's essentially with superposition or something like that. When you're talking or tunneling or something of that nature, you're looking at something being undetermined until what seems to me to be the act of observation. I mean, that's crazy to explain consciousness causing the realization of classical objects.
And so I would say it's not observation; it's just interaction.
Interaction. Okay, that makes more sense.
The only interactions that we know about are the ones that we observe, right? But that's by the by. I think that sort of thing was happening obviously before there was any being to observe it. And even the founders of quantum mechanics, I think, realized that observation was not the thing; that interaction was the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the same thing as well. And I've always kind of found it an enigmatic thing to convey linguistically and scientifically, that of observation causing, because then you're forced to evolve to a ethereal explanation. You're forced to, you have to, and at that point you're dispensing not with so much with logic, but with speculation that's semi-rooted in logic, which is not the best way to go about science, I guess. I wouldn't assume. But not to deviate too much, but to kind of return back to briefly when we were talking about the circuitry that's ingrained into the brain, the similarities between all of our brains, the left and right hemisphere, the connection of the corpus callosum, that is neurotypical between every individual, and the circuitry itself becomes different. Just like you were saying, in monozygotic twins, you're able to, even in the same nurture, in the same household, develop 2 completely different characteristical personalities. And that in itself is interesting, because then we can't really apply, like you were saying, IQ and things are generalizable. So that's why we utilize them as tools of measurement. Well, you can't, like I think there's a quote from Einstein, maybe I'm misattributing it, but it was, you can't really judge a fish's ability to climb a tree. So you can't really take 2 monozygotic twins and say, well, I mean, they obviously have oriented their meaning in a different direction that has strengthened those interconnections within their brain to attune to a different area of desire or of meaning or of actualization. And to me, that's pretty interesting, just because of it shows that there's a very much so a dynamic system there that's not just genetic. And also the segue I wanted to get to was how you were looking at the emerging model of the brain. I had spoken with Dr. Jonas Kaplan, who's a neuroscientist at USC, and I was asking his opinion on kind of what does the future of the model of the brain look like? Is it going to stay this compartmentalized physical one-for-one lobe versus, temporal parietal lobe, or is it this network model where we're seeing just massive amounts of interactions in different hemispheres of the brain? Obviously, we know there's specialized regions of visual perception. So if you lesion those, you lose vision. But we also know that if you lesion certain other areas, they regrow and you reform the ability to perform those tasks later. So I wanted to just ask, how do you see that dynamic model of the brain as it relates to this?
Yeah. Well, I think so. To me, it feels like right now that neuroscience is really maturing as a field, and I think we're moving beyond the sort of isolationist, highly modular view of the brain, where it was the job of neuroscience to say this part of the brain does that, and this part of the brain does this, and it was kind of just pointing to bits of the brain and not much else. And we have many more and much more sophisticated tools now to go in and look at the activity of populations of neurons, tens of thousands of neurons in some creatures, all the neurons in the brain in some really simple creatures, actually, while they're awake and behaving and doing different things. And that is an absolute game changer in terms of our understanding of the dynamics of what's happening and the actually where the meaning is, right? What is carrying the meaning in all of these signals? And it used to be when we would, record from individual neurons one at a time, maybe two at a time if we were lucky. You get the detailed firing of electrical potentials, and you try and look within that for some kind of a code for, say, something out in the world. But actually, it's much more population-based than that, certainly in animals with big brains. And really, there's a whole sort of science now looking at these patterns so if you think about any part of the brain, any population of neurons, as a potentially being in a very, very high dimensional space, if each one of those neurons could be either firing or not firing, even just for a binary sort of property like that, then you've got 1,000 neurons, then you've got, this massive explosion of dimensionality for states that population could be in. But it turns out that the actual population doesn't enter all of those states because of all these feedback connections between it. Only a certain subset of the states are possible, and only a subset will be visited by the dynamics of the activity. So that can be described by what's called a low dimensional manifold, which is a hugely powerful statistical way of analyzing this high dimensional data for experimental neuroscientists, but may also be the way that the brain analyzes the data, in that there's another population of neuron looking at this one, and it actually cares about the pattern. It doesn't care about all the details, right? So it can be, there's many sort of instantiations or microstates here that all have correspond to the same macro state, this position on a manifold, which is where the idea that the meaning is carried in the high level pattern, not the low level details. That's where that comes in, which I think is sort of, again, necessary to move beyond the idea that one neuron firing is driving the next one and driving the next one in this sort of inevitable mechanistic way. And I think a more appropriate way to think about it is that you've got one neuron here that's monitoring its inputs, and it's kind of coming to some decision about what its inputs are, and then it's telling everybody else. Or you've got a population of neurons that are doing the same thing with inputs from another population of neurons. So there it becomes a kind of a much more internally active process of inference on the information that each of them is getting, as opposed to this mechanistic electrical driving force that's pushing the neurons, right? I think that's just not the way neurons work. They're information gathering devices. They're not being pushed around. They're listening, and then they're sort of giving an output.
Yeah, I would seem to agree too, because they operate like we assume, or like we know in science. There's a multitude of different types of structural neurons. They're not all the same in nature. We had and especially when I was talking about anesthesia earlier, it was interesting to me when they do administer anesthesia, what seems to occur is not so much the dissolution of consciousness, but more so the interruption. If you look at the cortex and you see the stages up to the pyramidal neuron where you're having that high level cognition occur, that process is interrupted, not consciousness being necessarily removed, but it's being kind of reduced down to where the self-referential aspect of the pain and the experience isn't being attributed back to itself.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And it's really important to make that point that there's all kinds of different neurons. So there's probably thousands of different types of neurons, that they're morphologically distinct, they're electrochemically distinct, and they connect in extraordinarily specific ways. And, you know, all of that sort of broad plan is laid down in the genome. It's executed by these programs of development. But then, of course, there's lots of plasticity in those things. Then learning, right? They're developed, they're designed to learn, right? That's the point. So, yeah, when we think about how information and meaning is being carried in the brain, I think we're moving to a much more sophisticated kind of understanding of that. And it's coupled with the computational tools to actually analyze that and, you know, run these big simulations and so on, and actually probe it. So we can get the data on the one hand from many more neurons at a time, but we also have the computational tools to analyze that in much more detail.
Exactly. And that's kind of the hard part of it, is when we compute that data, and then the analysis portion of it. It's what's mediating that analysis. What if we're converting bits and bytes of information, and then we're computing that reality? What is that conversion mediation process that's taking that sensory data and converting it into something that we attribute to self, and apply that to a future self, by which we can act in a way now that, okay, we can deny ourselves pleasures that would normally be evolutionarily desirable, because we would inevitably want to procreate as much as possible, so we would ultimately copulate with the entire population. But instead, we recognize that that's probably not going to benefit us. And so when I think about your explanation of higher level neurons comparing to lower levels as establishment of meaning, it still seems to me like that self-referencing itself, almost like it still seems like there would be a circular realm that would have to compare itself to. But I guess that's reductionist that we're trying to get over.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I certainly wouldn't suggest that the framework that I've said to you is anything more than a sketch for how that can come about. And I don't claim to understand how that, you know, the mysteries of that sort of self-referential consciousness or subjective experience. But I think there's a kind of a naturalistic footing for it, at least, and that's a start. I don't think we have to invoke any kind of supernatural things. We don't have to invoke any really, you know, novel physics or broadly, you know, massively new ideas. It's just sort of well, I mean, we'll see, I guess. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to take you outside your realm or imply that you were I didn't mean it came off that way, but more or less.
No, fine. I mean, I'm happy to sort of speculate about this, which I think is the best that any of us can do. But that, I mean, you know, I don't know if you've read Douglas Hofstadter's work in Gödel, Escher, Bach, or I Am a Strange Loop. But it's all about that idea of self-recursiveness. And to me, I guess there's one element there that always kind of trips people up, because it feels like circular causation, right? Yeah. It feels like you've got top-down causation at the same time as bottom-up, or you've got the whole thing causing its parts to do something, but it's made of its parts, and they're causing the whole thing at the same time. And I think that's not right. It's not circular causation, it's spiral causation, right? You're just looking at the circle. It's like you're looking at a slinky head on, right? If you turn it, you'll see actually it's a spiral that goes through time. So it's not instantaneous. And once you get away from that instantaneous mechanistic view towards a historical causation, right, a diachronic causation, then a lot of those sort of metaphysical problems of whole part causation or self-causation evaporate. And to me, you have a much more perfectly sort of reasonable understanding where high-level parts of the brain can send signals down to low parts, and they're talking up again. And not only is that sort of reasonable, it's empirically observed, right? I mean, those sorts of reverberations are clearly happening in the brain, and they're over some duration of time, right? There's nothing instantaneous happening. It's all played out through time. then I think you get away from a lot of these conundrums that people have gotten really hung up on in terms of the metaphysics of it.
Yeah, no, that's actually really neat way to conceptualize it, especially the diachronic use, that language there. It's interesting because it reminds me of kind of Aristotelian philosophy, that how Greeks, they have time and chronos, and they represent it as two different types of things. One as the present moment that we exist within, and one as the ever progressing disorder of the universe. And that's a that spiral shape kind of makes more cyclical sense to me than a cyclical circle. Yeah. Very much so, actually. And it kind of helps me ultimately conceptualize that maybe, like you had argued in your paper that I had read, which historicity being a major portion of this causality, potentially that model would imply that time is a byproduct potentially of memory and action almost interacting with each other. Like as you compare past to present and present to future, you're creating historicity and memory, and that's forming time, which is ultimately kind of an easier way to conceptualize naturalistically consciousness and agency, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think so. I wouldn't go so far, I guess, as to suggest, and maybe I'm not sure if this is what you're implying, that our agency is, creating time. I think that time is just happening in terms of these interactions in the present, defining the present as the period in which events happen, and the accumulation of events gives us that timeline. And what's important is that there's a direction of time, right? We're from indefinite in the future to definite in the past, and that's because of the irreversibility of phenomena, which actually hinges on indeterminacy. If there's no indeterminacy, then things go reversibly both ways. But once you have some indeterminacy, then something gets resolved. It becomes definite. Now you have an arrow of time. And of course, we experience that arrow of time, and there's loads of interesting sort of neuroscience and psychology about how our brains process time and how we experience it subjectively and so on. To me, that's a secondary question, but one that's obviously hugely important for how we interact in the world.
Absolutely. No, and getting back to the premise of agency, of course, and getting back to what your specialty of genetics, we were talking about, once again, monozygotic twins. What do you think, as a geneticist, especially, this is such an interesting question to frame to you, as whenever we do see such a difference in monozygotic twins nurtured in the same environment with the same nature, and their brains, of course, are stereotypically the same, but they're different. Do you think that it's meaning and the pursuit of that certain meaning that causes that difference to occur? Obviously, genetics being a little more dynamic model now.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, twins are an interesting case because they start with the same genetics, and even by the end of development, right? If you think of development as a trajectory, as opposed to just a static outcome, then they have followed a different trajectory to get to a slightly different outcome in the way their brains are wired, just as they have a slightly different outcome in the way that their faces and shapes and bodies have formed, right? And that trajectory, so that, for me, that's the kind of key link that you need to understand the relationship between genotypes and phenotypes, is to say, well, there is no direct relationship. To get from genotypes to phenotypes, you have to go through development. And development adds its own variation. It's just an idiosyncratic expression of the information that's in the genome, but it's going to be different every time you run the program. But that continues through life, right? It continues after birth in terms of our own cognitive development, our engagement with the world, mediated by our own agency, creating our own environment, selecting things, and obviously, in some ways and for some people, with more freedom than for others, right? I mean, some of us are more constrained in our social circumstances than others. Some of us have more opportunities and so on to self-actualize. But I think all of that, thinking of it again as a process that proceeds through time, is the key to understanding that, as opposed to saying, well, right now you have this personality, or you're like this. Well, you right now are you're not even the self. The self is the continuity through time. And so you're just a kind of a momentary avatar of this self that goes from the past to the future. And I think that processual kind of way of thinking about selves is actually key to understanding agency as well, because it embeds historicity in it right from the get-go. That's the whole point, is to have continuity of the self through time. So the past self is informing the current self of what to do for the sake of the future self.
Yeah, absolutely. That establishment of that autobiographical memory that is unique to the creation of self. And the creation of self is unique to what seemingly to humans, to the human brain, the nervous system, the idea of me and other, because it seems like maybe babies, when they're infantile, haven't yet, I mean, I don't know this for a fact. I just, some of the research papers that I have read, it seemed to indicate that it's not immediate that a baby or an infant recognizes other as other and self as self. It's almost as if that, like you had said earlier, we require ultimate nurturing and care for a long time, because our brains are, too big to fit out of the birth canal, essentially. So we have to depend upon, parental, a lot longer than most other species. But it's like ultimately that linear progression over time is what's producing the self eventually, based on our environment.
Well, yeah, and I think of it as an emergent thing, right? And you're right to say that, babies have I don't know if they don't have any sense of self, but they certainly don't have the same sense of self that we have, right? They obviously have no biographical self. They have some inkling of their physical self, and they learn to, control their limbs when they seem to be kind of spazzing out. Just, they're basically running through programs of neural activity and remembering, oh, when I did this with this pattern was associated with this, right? So they're learning how to operate the machinery of their own bodies, basically. And they're learning how to calibrate their sensory information that they get and ground that in relation to, for visual things, grounding it in relation to what they can touch and so on. And, their vision is not much better at birth than how far they can reach. So all of that is an ongoing process. There's an emergence there of an enriching, I guess, of a sense of self through ontogenesis, right, through growth. And actually, that probably starts in the womb as fetuses are moving their limbs about. That's a crucial part of running pre-running some of the software to get to try and get it calibrated, even in the womb. But in terms of the sense of self, I don't think it's right to say necessarily that humans are the only things that have a sense of self. I think we're the ones that have a human sense of self, but I think other animals have a sense. They definitely do, because they control their own bodies, right? And they need, in a sense, to monitor their own bodies in the world. They need to monitor the outcomes of their own actions, the better to predict what's going to happen in the world and so on. So just again, in terms of, cybernetics and control theory, knowing that, for example, when you see something, visual moving in the world, knowing that it's moving versus you're moving is a crucial control parameter, right? So, which is why many organisms have this thing: when they're going to make a movement, they send a copy of that instruction to their perceptual system to say, hey, expect the world to change like this because I'm about to move. And so it kind of gets subtracted away. So you don't get surprised when you're walking. Suddenly the world is moving towards you, right? You're not freaked out all the time because you're expecting that to happen, right? So your perceptual system is already aware of that. And that can be really the basis for a subjective sense of self. You have to know, in some sense, that you are different from the rest of the world.
Yeah, inevitably that has to occur if you have a nervous system and you have other people and you have other organisms that are making choices that could endanger you. Essentially, you have to prioritize self over other survivalistically, naturalistically, just by natural selection, just by the overall persistence within the environment. That would be a requirement, I suppose, of that. And that's interesting, just that we do generate that sense of self. But what I find too kind of a little bit not paradoxical, because paradoxes seem to just be be kind of a useless word to use because they put us at an impasse in a dialogue. But it's the nature of altruism and the nature of acting in interest of other instead of self whenever it potentially actually endangers our own selves. So those kinds of things within genetics, getting back to genetics ultimately, it's interesting to me, the evolution of these types of altruistic, empathetic nature that we seem to have, and it seems to be counterintuitive to this rigorous survival of the fittest model of natural selection. So I wonder if maybe there's another influence of it, or if there's a portion of a genetic evolution that had chosen for these altruistic tendencies.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a huge area in evolutionary philosophy and biology, is trying to figure out where does altruistic behavior come from. And the general sort of, I guess, accepted view is based on kin selection. So the idea that actually, if this is really sort of reductive, gene-centric way of thinking, but if natural selection is selecting genes, that is genetic variants, that predispose to altruistic behavior, then it should select for ones where the altruism is directed towards either clones, right? In which case it's the same genes are going to be passed on, or kin, like offspring, in which case there's at least a 50% chance of the gene being passed on, right? And so, so by fostering, care for offspring, for example, you're selecting for genes that promote that behavior, and they're selecting for their own persistence, effectively. And so you can get what looks like sort of a morally or emotionally altruistic behavior, and you can recast that in the sort of selfish gene view and say, actually, we're just vehicles for our genes, and it's the passing on of the individual genetic variants that will allow selection for that kind of behavior. And I'm kind of torn about what to think about that. I mean, I think it's right? I mean, just mathematically, it's correct. And you can think about evolution and population genetics in terms of gene flow through organisms, right, over time. You could say the organisms are just kind of entries in the table. What's interesting is the way the genes flow through them over time from one generation to the next. And so, just mathematically, that's proven to be an accurate way of describing what goes on. Of course, it throws the organism kind of out the window. The organism is no longer the central sort of point of biology under that view. And again, it's a temporal perspective kind of issue. If you want to understand evolution over many generations or thousands of years, whatever, then you can take that view and you can understand why certain types of behavior can be selected for or can emerge, even if they seem, as you said, counterproductive to the individual. But if you take a closer view in the lifetime of an individual, then you see actually that the way that those predispositions are manifest in actual behavior is so far removed from the selfish gene kind of selection level, right? So that it's not that that's a wrong view. It's just a view that's valid in a shorter time perspective, and the selfish gene view is valid over a longer time perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what makes even more sense, like you had said, is kinship is and because in plants it seems even I had read some studies, so this makes sense evolutionarily, and the progeny that they select for, it was almost some of the studies I had read. It's like the plants would actually intend to send nutrients, utilizing the mutualistic relationship with the fungi that they could interconnect to each other with. They could actually select more intentionally for their own offspring. So there was demonstrations observationally that even at the plant level, prior to movement, prior to cell membranes, instead we had cell walls and rigorous different types of cells that were static organisms. Even then, were they utilizing this mutualistic selective kinship preferential treatment of their offspring? And so that could make sense if it's that archaic, that it would have eventually evolved to this level of maybe altruistic behavior towards something that's not kin, just because it's so hardwired that now potentially. But I think that
even in really simple organisms like slime molds, which are they spend a lot of their life as unicellular amoeba, so distinct individual amoeba. But at some point, if conditions get harsh and food is scarce, they aggregate together to form this multicellular organism, which moves around like a slug. Like, it's big enough to see. It moves around like a slug, and it finds some spot that it likes, and then it turns into like a little mushroom, It has a stalk, and it makes some spores in the head of this thing. And the cells that are in the spore cap will sort of disperse, and they can generate new amoeba, new individuals, whereas the cells in the stalk won't. So the cells in the stalk are giving up their chance to reproduce, basically, so that the other ones will reproduce. And that makes sense if they're all clonally related to each other. So if the individuals were dividing to generate clonal cells, and then they fuse later on into an aggregate, it doesn't make sense if there's non-clonal cells that are fusing together. And in fact, that possibility generates a kind of an arms race where non-clonal cells will try to contribute more to the spores than to the stalk if they mix together. But then that generates a mechanism for cells to reject, it's like an immune system where they reject non-clonally related amoeba. So they're actually selecting for only making multicellular organisms with cells that are clonally related to them. And so you have this kind of kin selection right there, down at the lowest level of even forming an aggregate, and generating what is effectively a germline. And of course, we do this in our bodies too, right? I mean, our cells, most of our somatic cells have given up the right to reproduce, but they're carrying out their functions in the service of the germline cells, which can reproduce and distribute the same genes that are in all of our cells.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting too, because when you talk about germ cells and somatic cells, it's you have mitosis of the somatic cell and you have almost direct replication, but then you have the process of meiosis in germ cells. That inherently is what we're depending upon for the variation to occur. And so that's it's an interesting phenomenon, the difference between the replication of germ cells versus
yeah, and then you get into the invention of sex and why we have it and why we sexually reproduce, or why some organisms do, and all kinds of potential conflicts evolutionarily between the genomes of the two sexes. There's a whole interesting world of biology right there.
Yeah, no, you're right, and I find it interesting too. Yeah, like you had said, the kinship relationship and the mutualism that occurs and the symbiosis that's present within almost all interactive systems holistically, and that applies to ourselves, like you had said. You had mentioned in some of the talks I had listened to. The potential for us to go into autopilot modes of operation, and I just wanted to end basically to come to a conclusion here is agency. What we had talked about is inherent to meaning and contextually dependent. Once we operate within it, it's a byproduct, or it's an inevitability of the evolutionarily naturalistic approach. But the way that we lose agency can become something about the hardwiring of that circuitry to where we become on autopilot, essentially, to where our actions are so encoded that they basically are cyclical without our conscious, higher level conscious awareness acknowledging those behaviors. And so agency almost to me becomes critical to interrupting patterns, and to interrupt those patterns, it requires recognition of them. So understanding becomes essential to altering the autopilot patternistic behaviors that contribute to our own disorder.
Well, yeah, and I guess there's two ways to think about that, right? You can think about the habits that we form, this being on autopilot, as a negative thing to say, well, we're no longer in control, or you can think about it as a much more positive thing that's selected for, because it's incredibly efficient, right? When we've learned things about the world and they're regular enough that it turns out that every time I'm in this situation, it has been a good thing for me to do X, Y, or Z, then the next time I'm in it, I'm just going to do X, Y, or Z, or whatever it is. And I don't have to spend any effort thinking about it. And I don't have to take the time to think about it. It's just massively more efficient. And most of our behavior is habitual like that. And I think that's an exercise of agency, even though we're not consciously necessarily paying much attention to it at the time. First of all, it is the expression of what we've learned as ourselves. It's the expression of the continuity of our behavior through time. So I think that absolutely fits my definition of agency. But secondly, we have the capacity to monitor those things and engage control if we want to, right? I mean, it's not always the case that we're on autopilot obligately and we can't sort of take the wheel, as it were, if we need to, right? If something changes, you're driving home and you realize, oh, I need milk, right? And so you turn right instead of left where you normally would, or you find you've driven left and forgotten to turn right.
Yeah.
Right, but so we have, yeah, so I see that in a really much more positive sense. I think habits get a bad rap. If it weren't for habits, we'd be toast. I mean, we can't just go around thinking about everything we do from first principles all the time, right? We'd be exhausted and never get anything done.
We can't construct bottom up everything whenever there's already been a pyramid there constructed for us.
We have super useful habits and heuristics and policies. We have long-term commitments and projects that we're engaged in. We make decisions now that sort of pre-decide what we're going to do in the future. And all of that is very, very efficient and adaptive.
Yeah.
And then, of course, sometimes there's maladaptive situations, and sometimes we recognize, oh, that's a bad habit. I wish I didn't do that. But we don't recognize as much, oh, that's a great habit, because those are the ones that, they don't draw our attention very much. So I think all of that is control of agency. I would say that the ability to exercise cognitive, conscious, rational control is probably what would be required to call it free will in humans, right? So that's where I would sort of make a distinction and say, if you're going to call, anything free will, or justify the idea that we do indeed have free will, then I think that does require the ability to consciously reason things through, think about what you're doing, and rationally choose one option or another, which we do. I mean, there's no, I don't understand why some people think they don't do that, because it seems patently obvious that we do. Of course, we do it more in some situations than others, and some people may exercise it more strongly than others. But that doesn't mean the capacity doesn't exist. If anything, it illustrates the capacity exists because it varies between people.
No, that's great. Yeah, no, that's a great way to kind of conclude on our discussion, is to add that element of what's good about it. And additionally, like you said, when a pilot is flying a plane and you're sitting in there, you're trusting that when he's on autopilot, he still has the ability to express his free will to take the wheel, to control it. But we're glad he has autopilot, so he's not constantly expending energy that could be expended towards controlling the plane if it were going down or something like that. So I think and so that's neat, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking. It was very fascinating discussion.
My pleasure.
And it seemed to kind of wind its way through a lot of different avenues, but I feel as if it touched on a lot of cool topics, and I very much enjoyed it. So thank you so much for joining me.
That's the nature of those subjects, is that they are intertwined with each other. So
it kind of proves that kind of cycle of interaction between all those subjects. So I really appreciate your time and found it very interesting, and look forward to your work in the future.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a great day.
Okay. Bye. You too.
Bye.